Recently, I've had a few people send me links to a YouTube video posted by Creation Ministries International titled, "Why Natural Selection is Not Evolution." They make a bunch of claims about natural selection, about evolution, and the question I've been asked is, are the things that they're presenting in the video factually true? So, just to set this up, this video is an interview that they conducted with someone who they present as an expert in the field of biology and evolution, a man named Don Bratton. Don got his PhD in plant biology in the 1970s, then he had a career as a horticulturalist in the 80s and 90s. A horticulturalist is just a type of plant biologist. For the past 30 years, Don has worked for Creation Ministries International and has done some private consulting per his publicly available online resume. All right, here we go.
What is natural selection?
It's better defined as differential reproduction. That is, creatures or organisms which have certain genes or are better adapted to their environment, and therefore they actually leave more offspring. And they leave more offspring, they pass their genes on to the next population. So more of their genes get passed on to the next population in the future. And so that's natural selection. It's differential reproduction. It's the opposite of what is needed for evolution, because evolution needs a way for new genes to be created, not just get rid of existing genes.
Right out of the gate, here's something that Don and I agree on. Sure, natural selection can be thought of as differential reproduction. The only small correction I have here is where Don says genes.
Organisms which have certain genes or are better adapted to their environment, and therefore they actually leave more offspring.
I think he really means alleles. A gene is a stretch of DNA that codes for a specific protein or a specific enzyme. Proteins and enzymes are the molecular machines within our cells that are responsible for the functioning of our cells. They build cells, and by extension, they build tissues and organs, and so on. An allele is a version of a gene. So, for example, you and I both have a gene called the melanocortin-1 receptor gene, but we have slightly different versions of that gene that differ by only a couple of nucleotides. The melanocortin-1 receptor gene makes a special protein called the melanocortin-1 receptor. This receptor is involved in producing the pigment, or the color that we find in human hair and in human skin. So maybe your version of the protein functions in such a way that results in you having darker hair and darker skin, whereas my version of the protein functions in such a way where I have lighter hair and lighter skin. We have the same gene, just different versions of it. But that aside, the first claim is accurate. Let's look at claim 2 in this segment. Don says that natural selection is the opposite of what is needed for evolution because evolution needs new genes to be created. The idea here is that natural selection results in genes or alleles to be removed from populations due to this differential reproduction. So if, for example, people who have light brown hair, for some reason, were also severely limited in their reproductive output, then their version of the melanocortin-1 receptor gene that was responsible for that light brown hair would eventually be lost from the population. But what Don is saying here is for evolution to work, you need new genetic material to appear somehow, and therefore natural selection isn't what's needed for evolution.
It's the opposite of what is needed for evolution, because evolution needs a way for new genes to be created.
Don was off to a good start, but unfortunately he makes an error here. Natural selection is exactly what's needed for evolution. It's not the process that gives rise to new genetic information. Mutations give rise to new genetic information. But once that new information is present, then natural selection is that force, that circumstance that gives rise to that differential reproduction. So it's true that evolution needs new genetic information, but it's patently false that natural selection is the opposite of what evolution needs. So unfortunately, this claim is inaccurate. Let's move on.
Does the term natural selection imply that nature is choosing and has a goal in mind? Should Christians avoid the term, and is there a better term?
Natural selection doesn't mean that nature chooses, it's a metaphor. This sort of criticism is like saying the word hydrophobic. Oils are hydrophobic in the sense that they don't mix with water. Hydrophobic means water hating, literally. So does that mean that this term shouldn't be used because it attributes feelings to, oils or something? No, it's ridiculous. Christians don't need to avoid the term, and it's not attributing to nature something that's choosing or anything like that. It's just a metaphor. So we need to understand that natural selection is not evolution, but it's not something we need to avoid.
Okay, Don makes a claim here that natural selection is a metaphor because nature isn't choosing. And I agree with this. I want to go back to his term, differential reproduction. Natural selection is sort of differential reproduction based on how well an individual's traits help that individual to excel and reproduce in a given environment. So this is accurate. Then he makes this second claim, that natural selection is not evolution. True, natural selection is only part of evolution. You see, DNA mutations lead to new enzymes and proteins within cells. Those new enzymes and proteins can lead to new traits and new characteristics. If those new traits and characteristics are beneficial, then they're passed on to the next generation at a higher frequency. So only the last part of what I've just summarized here would be the natural selection part. So Don's statement is correct here, but for entirely the wrong reason. So for that, I'm going to rate this claim as misleading. Let's go to the next clip.
As a creationist biologist, do you agree that natural selection exists and is scientific?
I have no problem with natural selection. No problem at all. But it removes genetic information and it does the wrong thing for evolution. It removes genes from populations, genes that aren't adapted, if you like, to the conditions of that population. For example, wolves with short hair would be subject to freezing death in cold conditions. And so what happens is their genes for short hair are lost from the population, whereas the genes for long hair persist because they're adapted to the cold conditions. So evolution needs to create new genes, not just to get rid of genes. It needs to create new ones, and natural selection doesn't do that, so it's not evolution.
So it exists, but it's not tantamount to evolution.
Correct.
Okay, this is good. Don has no problem with natural selection. Don then makes the claim that natural selection removes genetic information. I've already given him credit for this. Don and I agree. Natural selection exists. It removes genetic diversity from a population. He says that it removes genes from populations, which isn't usually the case. It most often removes alleles, or versions of a gene, from a population. Although I've already given him credit here, who says you can't have too much of a good thing? This claim is accurate. Don then claims that natural selection does the wrong thing for evolution. I think we're coming back here. We're returning to one of Don's key confusions about natural selection and evolution. Natural selection is only one part of the entire suite of processes that function together as the greater and grander process of evolution. Don's claim here that natural selection does the wrong thing for evolution would kind of be like me saying that brakes do the wrong thing for automobile travel. Cars are machines that travel from one point to another using a combustion engine, and brakes actually stop cars from moving. So therefore, mechanized travel cannot exist because brakes exist and they function to stop cars from moving. I'm obviously ignoring all the other parts of the car. But that's what Don is doing here. He's actually ignoring the key generative processes that are part of evolution. So his claim here is definitely inaccurate. Now let's look at the example that Don provides. He provides this narrative of wolves with short and long hair. He claims that the genes for short hair can be lost from the population. I don't know if he's giving this as a theoretical example or if he's actually referencing a scientific study. But here's what we can say. Genetic mutation is a factual process. Sometimes those mutations make enzymes work better than they did before. Sometimes those mutations reduce the functional ability of enzymes, and we have dozens of examples of this. In the case that Don describes, it's not about genes being lost from a population. It's about certain alleles or certain versions of a gene that no longer exist. But the basic fundamental sequence of whatever gene that is still present. Over time, as wolf generations come and go, the fundamental sequence of that gene that remains can still mutate, and short hair can emerge once again in wolf populations. And when you think about this, we've done this with dog breeding over and over. If the ancestral dog looked something like a wolf, we've been able to select dogs that have various hair mutations to produce all kinds of long and short-haired dogs. And here's the key thing. All of those dogs have the same genes. So when it comes down to it, Don mixes up genes and alleles in his story. His claim isn't in line with what we know about traits appearing or disappearing in populations over time. Nor is it supported by the genetic work that's been done on hair length in canines. And we have lots of evidence from dog breeding that you can actually get short-haired dogs from long-haired dogs. And so for all these reasons, his example here is factually unsupported and therefore inaccurate. Let's go to the next clip.
We're told that natural selection is evidence for evolution. Is this true?
Well, a classic example would probably be Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, and they've got different shaped beaks designed or suited for different food. And so certain finches are adapted to eating insects, other ones are adapted to eating hard seeds. And so with the availability of food varying from season to season, certain finches are going to do better or worse depending on which beaks they have. And so the numbers of finches with different beaks goes up and down depending on the availability of food. There's natural selection going on here, there's adaptation going on here, there's even speciation going on here. I don't have a problem with the story, but we've still got finches, and the variety we see in those finches is much less than we see, for example, in breeds of dogs, which have been bred in the last couple of 100 years. Nobody says the dogs are becoming something else.
All right. In this clip, Don describes natural selection exactly in line with how he defined it: differential reproduction. Don says that there's natural selection going on, there's adaptation going on, and there's speciation going on. Don then says that the issue with this is that they're all still finches. Except they're not. I mean, the irony in that statement is that Darwin's finches are not actually true finches. They've mutated and changed so much from other birds in the Passeriform order of birds that they're now actually in their own subfamily of birds called the Geospizinae. This subfamily, Geospizinae, is actually probably part of a family of birds called the tanagers, which aren't very closely related to true finches or the Fringillidae at all. Darwin's finches are genetically more similar to warblers and blackbirds and orioles than they are to true finches. So I need to ask Don for more clarification here. You could look at the species of finch that are within the Geospizinae in the Galapagos and say, yeah, well, they're all still part of the Geospizinae, but these species are actually different enough that they're classified into 4 separate genera of birds: the Certhidae, the Platyspiza, the Geospiza, and the Camerenchus. So I'm not exactly sure what Don was expecting to happen here. Was Don hoping that these birds would have evolved into different subfamilies or into different families in the Galapagos? Or was he wanting them to evolve into something other than birds? The fact that there's been speciation in this small archipelago of islands within a subfamily of birds is actually pretty cool. And again, these birds are significantly different from other subfamilies and families in the Passeriform order. And then Don talks about dogs still being dogs after several hundred years of selective breeding, which actually doesn't tell us much about the example of bird evolution here. Was Don expecting that dogs should evolve into non-dogs over the span of a few hundred years through the power of mutations and selection? So I don't really know how to score his example here. It's not really accurate. Is it inaccurate? Is it misleading? I think I'll make up a new category just for this example: I'm going to rate this one as confusing. Let's look at the next one.
Do you think natural selection is being taught well at high school?
Generally not. And the reason is they're not talking about mutations. They're presenting examples of natural selection and then claiming to the students that, oh, this is evolution, there you are, evolution's true. But it's not, because mutations are the only mechanism they have for the new information. And they don't talk about mutations much at all, if at all. And that's quite deceptive. It's being taught very badly.
So they're not giving the new modern synthesis.
No, they're going back to Darwin 150 years ago.
Here, Don claims that they're not doing a good job teaching natural selection in high schools because they're not talking about mutations. I'm going to underline this again. Natural selection and genetic mutations are two different processes. But Don says that natural selection isn't being taught well because they're not talking about mutations. It's kind of like saying, do you think they're doing a good job teaching about the mechanics of braking in automotive school? Well, generally not, because they're not talking about engine combustion. Whether or not they talk about engine combustion is independent of how adequate their teaching is on the topic of braking mechanics. And how well natural selection is taught in high schools is independent of how well genetic mutation is taught in high school. But you can't understand evolution in a holistic way without understanding both natural selection and mutations. So, because he didn't answer the actual question here that was asked, I'm going to rate his response as misleading. So, what about the claim that high schools just aren't talking about mutation? Well, this one's tricky. Neither Don nor I are in high schools across America, but there is something called the Next Generation Science Standards that many states use as a guiding document when it comes to the key concepts that should be taught. And you can find mutation in both the middle school standards and in the high school standards. Mutations are central to the teaching and learning of genetics both in high school and in higher education. So on this part, it looks like Don's claim is inaccurate. Let's go to the next clip.
Why is natural selection pushed as evolution?
It's part of this endeavour to get people to believe it. So they want people to believe in evolution rather than believe in God. So how do you do that? Well, you show them something obvious, like an example of natural selection, and you say, oh, that's evolution. They say, oh, okay, evolution must be true. But it's actually quite deceptive, because without mutations, evolution can go nowhere. And they don't talk about mutations much because they know that people understand that they don't do the job.
I guess the first thing I want to note here is that the question itself in this case has a claim built into it. That claim is that natural selection is pushed as evolution. There's no evidence presented for this claim, so rather than give it a rating, I'm merely going to note it as unsubstantiated. Now let's look at what Don says. Don says that natural selection is pushed as evolution because they want people to believe in evolution more than they want people to believe in God. Okay, I'm not exactly sure who they are, but if they are science teachers, then yes, I think this is probably true. Science teachers want students to have a good handle and a good grasp on the processes of evolution more than they want students to learn about God, because that's their job. So I think that part of his claim is probably accurate. After that, Don claims that you can get people to believe that evolution is true by showing them natural selection. I think natural selection is the easiest part of evolution to understand, but natural selection, again, is only part of the story. And I think his claim that's sort of built in here, that people are only shown natural selection, is misleading at best. We could look at Darwin's book on the origin of species, where literally in the first chapter of his book, he mentions this phenomenon of new traits and new characteristics appearing in populations over time. Darwin recognized the need for new genetic material as part of the process. We could look at modern textbooks that have sections on evolution by natural selection, followed by sections called evolutionary processes, where they talk about population genetics, mutation, genetic drift, and so on. I have a textbook called Evolution, written by famous evolutionary biologist Douglas Futema, and only 2 out of his 22 chapters deal directly with natural selection. So I think that this assertion made here that educators only teach natural selection when it comes time to learn about evolution is probably inaccurate. Okay, one final clip.
When talking about natural selection and evolution, is there a key takeaway?
Well, the key takeaway is that natural selection does operate in today's world, but it's not evolution. As Hugo de Vries said in 1905, evolution might explain the survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. The only thing that explains the arrival of the fittest, in other words, the arrival of new features, which evolution needs, is mutation. And mutation, as accidental changes to existing genetic information, doesn't do the job. Random changes to specified instructions on the DNA mess them up, and they destroy us, they don't create us. And this is a fundamental problem.
The first claim, natural selection operates in today's world. Nothing more needs to be said here. We've gone over this. This is accurate. The second claim, natural selection is not evolution. I agree. Natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection is part of evolution. So this too is accurate. The third claim. Here, Don quotes a scientist named Hugo de Vries. He was a famous botanist who lived from 1848 to 1935. According to Don, Hugo de Vries said,
evolution might explain the survival of the fittest, but it doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest.
But that is not what Hugo de Vries said, and you can look this up for yourself anywhere. Hugo de Vries actually said, natural selection explains the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest. And de Vries is 100% correct here. De Vries's work, along with other early geneticists like Thomas Hunt Morgan, and of course Watson, Crick, and Franklin, helped to pave the way for our modern understanding of how genetics work, how mutations work, and how mutations give rise to new sequences of DNA, and how mutations can work with natural selection within the process of evolution. So, because he got the quote wrong, this one is inaccurate. Okay, last but not least, Don claims that random changes to specified instructions on DNA messes up those instructions and destroys us. There's lots of examples of functional changes to DNA that don't mess up the message as much as they do change the message. Let me just give you one example. The reason that most of you can see things in what we consider to be full color vision is that there were some errors that occurred in DNA copying in one of our ancestor species millions of years ago. We all have a gene called the medium wave sensitive opsin gene. This gene makes a special receptor in the cone cells of our eyes called the medium wave sensitive opsin, which can detect some colors. Well, this gene was duplicated long ago during the process of meiosis. This happens when something called unequal crossing over occurs. Then, one of those duplicated copies picked up some mutations. These mutations shifted the functional abilities of the opsin protein that was produced from these duplicated copies so that cone cells could now detect an additional set of colors. This mutation was adaptive, meaning that it was accompanied by differential reproduction, as Don would call it, and was thus inherited by all the ancestor species that arose thereafter, including humans. So, once again, Don's claim is inaccurate. Well, how did he do? 6 claims were accurate, 7 claims were inaccurate, 2 were misleading, 1 was confusing, and there was a statement made by the interviewer that was unsubstantiated. Don's mistakes mostly stem from his tendency to mix up the terms gene and allele, and his unwillingness to recognize that natural selection is only a component of evolution. I hope that this analysis was useful. If you'd like more analysis videos like this, just let me know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.